He heard it before he saw it. A German tank crewman, crouched in a wheat field east of Kursk in the summer of 1943, would later describe the sound the same way a dozen other men described it. A low, grinding drone, coming in from the tree line at the height of a man on horseback. Not the clean scream of a fighter diving from altitude, something heavier, something that sounded like it was dragging the sky down with it. By the time he could see the silhouette, it was already too late to run. A blunt-nosed aircraft painted the color of mud and ash, skimming the grass at better than 200 miles an hour, and riding under each wing, a row of rockets and the snouts of 2 cannon that could open the back of a panzer like a tin of meat. The German troops on the Eastern Front had a name for this machine. They did not call it by its Soviet designation. They called it the Schwarze Tod, the Black Death. This is the story of the aircraft that earned that name. How the Soviet Union built a flying tank to hunt men and armor at treetop height. How it became the single most produced combat aircraft in the history of the world. And how, even as it slaughtered German columns by the thousand, it sent its own crews into the meat grinder at a rate that should have broken any air force on Earth. So, how does a single airplane end up with a nickname whispered by the men it was built to kill? To understand that, you have to go back to a workshop in Moscow, years before the first German tank ever crossed the Soviet border. Moscow, the late 1930s. A Soviet aircraft designer named Sergei Ilyushin was chasing an idea that most engineers of his day thought was impossible. He wanted to build an attack plane that could fly low, slow, and straight into the teeth of ground fire and survive it. Ilyushin was not some outsider tinkering in a shed. He was one of the most senior aircraft men in the Soviet Union, a designer who would go on to win the country's top engineering prize again and again over his career. When a man with that much standing bet everything on an idea the rest of the world had rejected, people noticed. And in the Soviet Union of the 1930s, betting wrong on a weapon could cost a designer far more than his job. Every other air force in the world was solving the ground attack problem the same way. You took a fast aircraft, you sent it in quick, you dropped your load, and you got out before the gunners on the ground could draw a bead on you. Speed was the armor. Stay high, stay fast, stay alive. Ilyushin looked at that logic and threw it out. He had watched what happened to lightly built aircraft when they came down low to support troops. Rifle, fire, machine gun fire, light flak. The little planes came apart in the air. So he asked a different question. What if the plane itself was armored, not bolted on plates as an afterthought? Armor built into the bones of the aircraft, carrying the load, holding the whole machine together. That was the breakthrough. On his design, the steel shell was not cargo. It was the structure. A single curved tub of armored steel that wrapped around the engine, the cooling system, the fuel tanks, and the pilot, all of it. Mechanics and crews would later call it the armored bathtub. The Germans, with grim respect, would call the whole airplane the Betonflugzeug, the concrete plane. Think about how strange that was. On almost every other warplane of the era, the airframe was a light skeleton of wood or thin aluminum, and the metal skin was just a cover stretched over it. Ilyushin flipped that idea inside out. He made the armor do the work of the frame. The thing that protected the crew was the same thing that held the wings on. It made the Sturmovik heavier and harder to build than any normal aircraft of its size, and it made it nearly impossible to kill with small arms fire from the ground. The first prototype flew on the 2nd of October, 1939. It carried the workshop designation TEAS KB-55. By January of 1941, the design had a new name and a production order. It was the Ilyushin Il-2, the Sturmovik. But a flying tank has a problem, and Ilyushin knew it from the start. Armor is heavy, and heavy aircraft do not fly well. The early Sturmovik was a brute to handle. It was overloaded and, by the standards of a sleek fighter, underpowered. To haul all that steel into the air, it eventually got a Michelin AM38-5 engine, a V12 putting out around 1,720 horsepower. That was enough to drag the machine up to a top speed of about 251 miles an hour, measured down low, around 5,000 feet, which is exactly where this aircraft was built to fight. That number matters. 251 miles an hour is not fast for 1943. A German fighter could run it down without straining, but the Sturmovik was never trying to win a race. It was trying to get in close, point itself at a column of vehicles, and stay alive long enough to tear them apart. And to do that, it carried a load of weapons that could ruin almost anything on the ground. How much firepower are we talking about? Hang on, because this next part is the reason German tankers learned to fear that engine note. Look at what a late-model Sturmovik brought to the fight. In the wings sat two 23mm WWII-23 cannon. These were not machine guns. These were autocannon firing shells thick enough to punch through the thinner top and rear armor of a tank, and more than enough to shred trucks, half-tracks, fuel bozers, and any man standing near them. Alongside them, two 7.62mm SKAS machine guns sprayed the ground to keep the gunners' heads down. Then came the heavy stuff. Under the wings, the Sturmovik could carry up to around 1,300 pounds of bombs. Or it could load rockets, as many as 8 of the RS-82 type, or a smaller number of the larger RS-132. A single salvo of those rockets, fired from a few hundred yards out at grass-cutting height, walked across a column like a scythe. And on the very specialized versions, the engineers went further still. They bolted two 37mm anti-tank cannon under the wings, guns big enough to crack open armor that the smaller weapons could only scratch. Now picture all of that coming at you at once. The drone of the engine, then the cannon, then the rockets, then the bombs. All of it delivered from an aircraft so low you could almost read the numbers on its fuselage, and so heavily armored that your own return fire seemed to bounce off it. That is the picture that lived in the heads of the men who named it. And the name took hold in a very specific place, at a very specific moment. The winter of 1941. The defense of Moscow. By then, the German army had torn hundreds of miles into Soviet territory. Whole Soviet armies had been encircled and destroyed. The Sturmovik was rushed into this catastrophe in small numbers, thrown at the advancing columns on the roads west of the capital. And on those frozen roads, the German soldiers started telling each other about a low-flying killer that would not die. They fired at it, and it kept coming. They watched it cut down the men around them and then bank away into the grey sky to come back for another pass. It was here, in the fighting for Moscow, that the nickname spread from man to man through the German ranks. The Black Death. It is worth being honest about where that name comes from, because the story has been told sloppily for 80 years. There is no single German document, no signed order, where an officer christens the Sturmovik the Black Death. The name lives in the accounts of German frontline troops, repeated in veteran memories and gathered up by historians long after the guns went quiet. What the records show, consistently, is this. The men on the receiving end gave it that name. The butcher, the meat grinder, the Black Death. It was a name born out of fear. On the German side of the line, not a slogan invented by Soviet propaganda. And Moscow held. The Sturmovik did not win that battle by itself, nothing did, but it was there, low over the snow, when the German advance finally ground to a stop in sight of the capital. If the Germans feared the aeroplane, the man running the Soviet Union was obsessed with it, and that obsession is one of the strangest, most telling parts of this whole story. In the autumn of 1941, as factories were being torn from their foundations and shipped east to escape the German advance, production of the Sturmovik stumbled. Whole plants were loaded onto trains and hauled deep into the interior, to cities far behind the lines, and set back up in places where the snow blew in through walls that were not finished yet. Workers built aircraft in buildings that did not yet have roofs. And in the chaos of all that, the planes were not coming off the lines fast enough. So Stalin sent a message to the factory managers that has been quoted ever since. He told them the Red Army needed the Il-2 like it needed bread, like it needed the air it breathed. And then, in the same breath, he made it brutally clear what would happen to the men responsible if the planes did not start flowing. This was not a compliment. It was a threat wrapped around the highest praise a weapon could receive. To Stalin, the Sturmovik was not one tool among many. It was as necessary as bread and air, and woe to anyone who slowed it down. Read that the way the factory managers would have read it. In that time and place, a telegram like that from the top was not motivation. It was a loaded gun pointed at your family. The message landed, and the lines started moving again, in half-built sheds, in the dead of a Russian winter, with the front line still close enough to hear. The factories got the message, and what happened next is the part of this story that almost defies belief. Quick thing before we get into the numbers. If you are the kind of person who actually wants to understand how the Eastern Front was won and lost, not just the famous battles but the machines that decided them, this is the channel for that. Subscribe and stick around. By the late summer of 1942, the fighting had shifted south to a ruined city on the Volga, Stalingrad, and the Sturmoviks went with it. Over Stalingrad, the Soviets had something on the order of 1,000 of these aircraft available across the long battle. They worked the German columns pressing into the city, they hit the supply lines feeding the attack, and they hammered the airfields and transport that the trapped German Sixth Army would later depend on for survival. The Sturmovik did not fight Stalingrad as a duelist in the sky. It fought it as a hammer, coming down again and again on whatever moved on the ground below. And when the encirclement finally snapped shut around the German army in the city, the armored attack planes were part of the cage that kept it closed. Now, the numbers behind all of it. By the end of the war, Soviet factories had built around 36,183 Sturmoviks. Sit with that figure for a second, because it is one of the most staggering production runs in military history. More Il-2s rolled out of Soviet plants than any other combat aircraft ever made, before or since. No fighter, no bomber, no attack plane from any nation in any war has matched it. There is a fair caveat to make here, and we will make it. If you count every aircraft ever built, including little civilian planes like the trainers and light aircraft that have been churned out for decades, then yes, a few of those beat the Sturmovik on raw numbers. But for a machine built to go to war, an armed combat aircraft, nothing else comes close. The Sturmovik is the king, more than 36,000 of them. And they were not sitting in hangars. By 1945, Sturmoviks had flown more than 600,000 combat sorties. 600,000 times, a Soviet pilot pointed one of these armored brutes at the enemy and went in low. That is the scale of the thing. A river of mud-colored aircraft pouring west year after year. But here is the detail everyone misses when they hear those glory numbers. Building 36,000 of something means you are losing a lot of them, and the Sturmovik was bleeding crews at a rate that tells you exactly how savage this kind of fighting really was. We will get to that horror, but first, the day the Sturmovik became a true tank killer. July 1943, the Battle of Kursk. This was the largest clash of armor the world had ever seen. The Germans threw their best tanks into a massive offensive, trying to bite off a huge bulge in the Soviet line. And waiting for them, in waves, were the Sturmoviks. Up to this point, killing a tank from the air was hard, ugly work. You had to line up the aircraft just right, get the angle right, and hit a small, moving, armored target with cannon fire while everyone on the ground shot back at you. Most pilots, especially the green ones being rushed to the front, simply could not do it reliably. Then, over the fields of Kursk, the Soviets unleashed a new weapon, and it changed the math. They were small anti-tank bomblets, known as PTAB. Each one weighed only about 5.5 pounds, a little black canister you could lift with one hand. But a Sturmovik did not carry one or two of them. It carried hundreds. Packed into the bomb bays, a single aircraft could rain down better than 200 of these bomblets in one pass. That changed everything about attacking armor from the air. Instead of betting the whole run on one perfect cannon shot, a Sturmovik now scattered a carpet of bomblets across a moving formation. Each one was tiny, but each one carried a shaped charge that could burn straight through the thin armor on top of a tank, where the steel was weakest. You did not have to aim at one tank. You aimed at the whole field, and let mathematics do the killing. Picture it from the German side. You are buttoned up inside your tank, advancing across open ground, and the sky fills with that grinding drone. Then it begins to rain, not water, a hail of small black shapes drifting down across your whole formation at once, and where they land, tanks brew up. The Black Death had found a way to kill the thing it was named to hunt, not one at a time, but in bunches. And the Sturmoviks had learned a way to fight as a pack. Over a target, a group of them would form a great wheel in the sky, one behind the other, a rotating ring the crews called the Circle of Death. Each aircraft guarded the tail of the one ahead. One by one they would peel off, dive on the column, loose their load, and climb back up to rejoin the wheel. The whole formation hung over the battlefield like a slow grinding mill, taking turns coming down, never leaving a gap in its own defense. For the men on the ground, it meant the punishment did not stop. As soon as one plane pulled away, the next was already tipping in. At Kursk, the Sturmovik came into its own as the terror of the German armored forces. Wave after wave, hour after hour, the armored attack planes worked the battlefield over. But, and this is the part the highlight reels leave out, the horror cut both ways. And to see that, you have to look at the man who was not even mentioned in the early design. Go back to the beginning of the production story for a moment, because there is a decision buried in it that cost thousands of lives. When the Sturmovik was first rushed into service, Soviet officials wanted it lighter and faster, so they made a fateful choice. They cut the rear gunner. The early aircraft flew as a single-seater, with the pilot alone in his armored tub and nothing covering the tail. German fighters figured this out fast. A Sturmovik was a fortress from the front and the sides, almost impossible to bring down with a head-on attack. But from directly behind and slightly below, it was blind and toothless. German pilots learned to slide into that blind spot, hang there, and hammer the unprotected tail until the aircraft fell. The flying tank had a wide-open back door, so the Soviets reversed the decision. They put a second crewman back in, a rear gunner, facing aft with a single 12.7mm UBT heavy machine gun to beat off the fighters sliding in from behind, and it helped. The tail gunners did start knocking German fighters out of the sky. But here is the cruelty of it. That armored bathtub, the famous shell that made the pilot so hard to kill, did not extend back to the gunner. The pilot sat inside thick steel, with armor plate on the order of half an inch around him in the critical places, and heavy glass in front of his face. The gunner sat behind all of that protection, in the open, with only a thin sheet of metal at his back, far less than what shielded the man up front. The result was exactly what you would expect, and it is grim. The rear gunners died at something like 4 times the rate of the pilots. Same aircraft, same mission, same sky. But the man in front rode home inside a steel cocoon, while the man a few feet behind him rode in a coffin with the lid off. Whole squadrons learned not to get too attached to their gunners. There are accounts of gunners drawn from punishment units and pulled in as last-minute replacements, men sent to fill a seat that everyone around them knew was the most dangerous place in the aircraft. Only later in the war did those men finally get a plate of armor of their own, a little over half an inch of steel. Far too late for the thousands already gone. That is the part that gets left out of the legend. The Black Death was a nightmare for the Germans. It was also, for a long time, a death sentence for the youngest, most expendable man on board. And the casualty figures for the whole program tell the same story in cold arithmetic. Remember those 36,000 aircraft. Now hold this number next to it. Across the war, somewhere around 10,762 Sturmoviks were lost in combat. That is close to a third of every single one ever built, shot out of the sky or smashed into the ground by the enemy. The worst year was 1943, the very year of the Great Triumph at Kursk. In that one year, something on the order of 3,500 Sturmoviks were destroyed. More than 3,500 armored attack planes gone in 12 months. To fly the Black Death was to fly straight at the densest, angriest concentration of ground fire on the planet, again and again, until either the war ended or your luck did. There were stretches of heavy fighting where the Soviets were losing one of these aircraft for every 10 missions flown. Think about what that means for a pilot doing the math in his own head. You climbed into the cockpit knowing that, on the bad weeks, the 10th time you flew was the one the odds were saving for you. And killing tanks from the air was never cheap. By some hard estimates, the Soviets lost several Sturmoviks, somewhere in the range of 5 to 10, for every Axis tank they managed to knock out. The Black Death earned its name on both sides of the line. And yet they kept coming. That is the thing that haunts the German accounts. You could hit one of these aircraft and watch it fly away. The Sturmoviks were famous for soaking up punishment that would have torn any other plane to pieces. The armored bathtub did its work even when the rest of the airframe was a wreck. A single aircraft might come home from one mission peppered with dozens of holes. There are documented cases of a Sturmovik landing with something like 600 bullet holes punched through it, getting patched up, and going back into the fight the very next day. The ground crews would count the damage, shake their heads, and have the thing flying again before the week was out. So, picture, one more time, the German soldier in that wheat field. He fires at the thing. He sees his rounds strike home. And the Black Death does not fall. It just keeps grinding through the sky toward him, an armored shell with cannon in its wings, built by the tens of thousands, sent into the worst fire on earth by a leader who valued it like bread and air. No wonder they feared it. No wonder they gave it a name out of a plague. He heard it before he saw it. By the time the war ended, hundreds of thousands of German soldiers had heard that same low, grinding drone come in over the tree line. The Sturmovik did not just help win the war on the Eastern Front, it became the sound of that front, the noise that meant the sky itself had turned against you. More than 36,000 of them were built. No combat aircraft in history was ever made in greater numbers. It was a flying tank, an armored coffin, a tank killer, and a meat grinder, all welded into one mud-colored machine. To the men who built it, it was as necessary as the air they breathed. To the men it hunted, it was the Black Death. If you want to see how the other great machines of the Eastern Front rose and fell, the tanks and aircraft that decided this brutal war, the next video is waiting for you on screen right now. Go watch it.